Hello, welcome to English After Midnight. I'm Alina, and tonight is for a specific kind of listener. Tonight is for the person who has been at B2 for longer than they expected, who reads English comfortably, who watches films without subtitles, who handles daily conversations with confidence, and yet who knows with quiet certainty that something is still missing. That their English is fluent but not quite free, correct but not quite natural, present but not yet fully alive. That gap, the one between B2 and C1, is one of the least discussed and most frustrating spaces in language learning. And tonight we are going to move through it. C1 is not about knowing more words. It is about how you hold ideas, how you structure long thoughts, how you use language not just to communicate information, but to shape perception, to frame, to qualify, to nuance, to persuade. C1. English sounds like a mind at work, not performing knowledge, but genuinely thinking, in real time, in a language that belongs to it. Tonight we will explore three things: the grammatical structures that define C1 English, the vocabulary that makes abstract ideas precise, and the discourse markers that make complex thought sound natural and intelligent. All of this, absorbed while you rest. Before we begin, subscribe to English After Midnight if this channel is part of how you grow. Press the bell, and welcome to the C1 lesson. Let's begin. Part 1, the structures that separate. B2 from C1. At B2, a learner can use a wide range of grammar accurately. Tenses, conditionals, passive voice, reported speech, all handled well. At C1, the structures become more sophisticated, more flexible, more expressive. The difference is not complexity for its own sake. The difference is that C1 structures allow you to do things with emphasis, nuance, and intellectual precision that B2 structures simply cannot. Tonight, 5 C1 structures, each explained and demonstrated. Structure 1, inversion for emphasis. In standard English, sentences follow subject-verb order. I have never seen such confidence. But in C1 English, especially in formal speech, academic writing, and sophisticated conversation, we invert the subject and auxiliary to create emphasis and rhetorical weight. Never have I seen such confidence. The inversion moves never to the front of the sentence, and the grammar follows. Auxiliary first, then subject. This structure is not archaic. It is alive in formal spoken English. In debates, in speeches, in thoughtful conversation between educated speakers. The most common inversion triggers. Never had she felt so understood. Rarely does one encounter such precision of thought. Not until she left did she understand what she had been part of. Only then did the full significance become clear. Hardly had she settled in when everything changed. No sooner had he spoken than the room fell silent. Practice these patterns. Feel their weight. They slow down speech in the best way. They give each idea the space it deserves. Never had I encountered a language that felt so simultaneously foreign and familiar. Rarely does a single conversation change the direction of a life, but occasionally it does. Not until I stopped trying to translate did I begin to think in English. Structure 2, cleft sentences for precision. A cleft sentence divides a simple statement into two clauses in order to emphasize one specific element. Where a B2 speaker says, "Her voice moved me," a C1 speaker can say, "It was her voice that moved me," bringing the emphasis exactly where it belongs. Two main types. It cleft. It was plus emphasized element plus that slash who plus rest of sentence. It was not the words themselves that stayed with her. It was the silence between them. It was only when I listened without trying that I began to truly hear. It is the small, accumulated moments that build fluency, not the dramatic breakthroughs. Which cleft? What plus clause plus is slash was plus emphasized element. What surprised me most was not how much I understood, but how natural the understanding felt. What distinguishes a C1 speaker is not vocabulary alone, but the ability to hold ambiguity with confidence. What she needed was not more grammar. It was permission to use what she already had. Cleft sentences are one of the clearest markers of C1 proficiency. Learn to reach for them naturally, and your English will immediately sound more sophisticated. Structure 3. Participle clauses. Participle clauses condense two ideas into one elegant construction. Instead of two separate sentences joined by and or because, the participle clause absorbs one action into a reduced form, creating economy and sophistication. Present participle. Simultaneous action. Instead of, she walked into the room and she smiled at everyone. C1. Walking into the room, she smiled at everyone. Having no prior experience, she approached the problem without preconceptions, which turned out to be an advantage. Listening carefully, you begin to notice the rhythm beneath the words. Past participle. Completed action preceding the main verb. Exhausted by the day's demands, she found the quiet of the evening restorative. Having considered every alternative, she returned to her original instinct. Given the complexity of the situation, her response was remarkably measured. Participle clauses compress thought without losing meaning. They make writing and speech feel dense, precise, and intelligent. Structure 4. The subjunctive. The subjunctive is a mood, not a tense, used to express wishes, recommendations, hypotheticals, and formal suggestions. In everyday B2 English, it is often avoided. At C1, it appears naturally. Formal recommendations and suggestions. I suggest that she consider the alternative. Not considers. It is essential that every learner be given time to absorb. Not is given. The committee recommended that he resign immediately. Not resigns. The key. In subjunctive constructions, the verb stays in base form regardless of subject. Fixed subjunctive phrases at C1. Be that as it may. Even if that is true, it doesn't change the conclusion. Come what may. Whatever happens. Suffice it to say, it is enough to say. I won't elaborate further. As it were, so to speak, used to soften a metaphor. These phrases signal a high level of fluency. They appear in intellectual discourse and mark a speaker as someone who has moved beyond the functional into the expressive. Structure 5. Hedging and qualification. At C1, you do not just state things. You qualify them. You acknowledge complexity. You signal how certain or uncertain you are about your claims. This is called hedging, and it is one of the most sophisticated skills in academic and intellectual English. Hedging language. It would appear that, more tentative than it appears that. There is reason to suggest that. Careful, evidence-based claim. One might argue that distancing yourself from the claim while still making it. It is perhaps worth considering. Inviting the listener to think, not commanding. To some extent, partial agreement or partial truth. With certain caveats. Introducing conditions or limitations. This is not to say that preventing misinterpretation of what you just said. Hedging does not make you sound weak. It makes you sound precise. It signals that you understand the complexity of the world and are not reducing it to false simplicity. This is what distinguishes C1 thought. C1 monologue. 1. Listen to this monologue. It uses all 5 structures from part 1. You do not need to analyze. Just absorb. What strikes me most about the journey from B2 to C1 is not what you gain. It is what you release. Not until I stopped monitoring my own grammar did I begin to speak with genuine fluency. Rarely does precision arrive through effort alone. More often, it arrives through a kind of surrender to the language, a willingness to let it move through you rather than constructing it piece by piece. Having spent years treating English as a system to be mastered, I began, slowly, to treat it as an environment to be inhabited. It was this shift, from mastery to inhabitation, that changed everything. It is perhaps worth considering that fluency is not a destination one reaches so much as a relationship one deepens. To some extent, we are always becoming, in language as in life. What distinguishes a C1 speaker is not the absence of uncertainty, but the ability to hold that uncertainty with confidence, to speak even into the places where the language is not yet fully settled. Be that as it may, the structures are important. They are the architecture within which thought moves freely. Learn them well, not to perform them, but to stop having to think about them. That is when language becomes truly yours. Part 2. The vocabulary of abstract thought. C1 vocabulary is not about knowing more words for ordinary things. It is about having precise language for abstract concepts, ideas, processes, qualities of thought, and experience. These are the words that allow you to discuss philosophy, psychology, culture, and meaning with accuracy and depth. Dichotomy. Dichotomy. A dichotomy is a division into two contrasting categories, especially when these are presented as opposites or mutually exclusive. The false dichotomy between emotion and reason has long shaped how we think about decision-making. She rejected the dichotomy entirely, arguing that fluency and accuracy were not opposites but partners. There is a useful dichotomy here between what we say and what we mean. Paradigm. Paradigm. A paradigm is a typical example, model, or framework, the set of assumptions and concepts that define how a field, system, or group of people understands the world. The shift from grammar translation to communicative language teaching represented a paradigm shift in education. Her work challenged the existing paradigm and was initially met with resistance. We are operating within a paradigm that rewards speed over depth. Trajectory. Trajectory. A trajectory is the path or direction of development over time. Originally a physics term, the curved path of a projectile, it has moved powerfully into everyday intellectual discourse. Her career trajectory was unconventional but entirely coherent in retrospect. The trajectory of the conversation shifted the moment he asked that question. What is the trajectory of your English? Where is it heading? Culmination. Culmination. A culmination is the highest point or final result of a process, the moment when everything that has been building finally arrives at its destination. Tonight's lesson is the culmination of months of evening listening. The performance was the culmination of 3 years of preparation. What appeared to be a sudden breakthrough was in fact the culmination of invisible work. Nuance. Nuance. Nuance is subtle difference or distinction, shades of meaning, feeling, or quality that are not immediately obvious. C1. English is the ability to perceive and articulate nuance. The nuance of the phrase was lost in translation. She spoke with extraordinary nuance, every word carefully chosen. Fluency is, ultimately, the ability to navigate nuance in real time. Contend. Contend. To contend is to argue or maintain a position, particularly in intellectual or formal discourse. It is stronger than suggest, but more measured than insist. She contends that language acquisition is fundamentally an emotional process. One might contend that the distinction matters less than we assume. I would contend that the real breakthrough comes not from study, but from immersion. Elucidate. Elucidate. To elucidate means to make something clear, to explain or clarify something complex or obscure. Allow me to elucidate the distinction between these two approaches. The example elucidates the principle more effectively than any definition could. She elucidated her argument with exceptional clarity. Encapsulate. Encapsulate. To encapsulate means to express the essential nature of something in a short, precise form, to contain and summarize something complex. That single phrase encapsulates the entire philosophy. Her response encapsulated everything that had been said in the previous hour. I want to encapsulate this idea in a sentence. C1 is the level at which English begins to think for itself. Posit. Posit. To posit means to put forward as a fact or basis for argument. It is intellectual and precise, used when proposing an idea for consideration. Let us posit that fluency is not linear. She posited an alternative explanation that nobody had considered. The researcher posited a direct connection between emotional state and language acquisition. Notwithstanding. Notwithstanding. Notwithstanding means despite, in spite of, used to acknowledge something while showing it does not change the conclusion. Formal, precise, and distinctly, C1. Notwithstanding the difficulty of the material, she made significant progress. The approach was unconventional, notwithstanding which it produced results. Notwithstanding her reservations, she agreed to proceed. C1 monologue. 2. I want to posit something that may initially seem counterintuitive. The trajectory from B2 to C1 is not primarily a grammatical journey. It is a conceptual one. At B2, the paradigm is functional. The goal is to communicate, to be understood, to understand. These are worthy goals, but at C1, the paradigm shifts. The goal becomes not merely to communicate, but to think, to use language as a tool for the exploration of complex ideas, the expression of nuance, the navigation of ambiguity. What I find myself contending, notwithstanding the conventional wisdom about grammar study, is that the most important C1 skill is not structural at all. It is the ability to sit with a complex idea, to hold it in your mind, turn it slowly, and find the English that encapsulates it precisely. Not approximately, precisely. The dichotomy between fluency and accuracy, so often posited as fundamental, begins to dissolve at C1. A speaker at this level understands that these are not opposites, but partners in a more sophisticated trajectory, the trajectory toward a language that thinks. What elucidates this best, perhaps, is a simple observation. At B2, you translate. At C1, you think. And the culmination of tonight's lesson, the moment toward which all of this has been building, is the moment when that shift begins. Not dramatically, quietly, the way all the most important things begin. Part 3. The discourse markers of intelligent speech. Discourse markers are the connective tissue of sophisticated language. At B2, learners use basic connectors. However, although, therefore, because. At C1, the range expands significantly. And the choice of marker signals the precise logical relationship between ideas. These are the markers that make C1 speech sound genuinely intellectual. Insofar as used to introduce a qualification, to the extent that something is true. Insofar as language reflects thought, improving one improves the other. This is true insofar as it goes, but it does not address the deeper question. Albeit, a compact way of saying although or even though, typically used mid-sentence to introduce a concession. She made significant progress, albeit slowly. It was a solution, albeit an imperfect one. He agreed, albeit with considerable reluctance. Hitherto, meaning until now or up to this point. Formal, precise, and surprisingly versatile. Hitherto, the connection between rest and language retention had been underestimated. This approach was hitherto unknown in the field. What has hitherto been a strength may, in changed circumstances, become a limitation. By extension. Used to draw a logical inference that follows from something already stated. If rest enhances memory consolidation, then, by extension, the hours before sleep are among the most valuable for language learning. His argument applies to grammar, and by extension to all acquired skills. In that, a precise connector meaning because of the fact that, more specific than a simple because, C1 is different from B2 in that it requires not just accuracy but precision. The lesson is unusual in that it works while you sleep. To that end, meaning for that purpose, used to connect a goal with the action taken to achieve it. She wanted to reach C1. To that end, she restructured her entire approach to learning. Fluency requires immersion. To that end, this channel exists. As it stands. Meaning in the current situation, used to describe the present state of things, often before proposing a change. As it stands, most learners plateau at B2 for lack of exposure to complex input. As it stands, the evidence favors a comprehension-first approach. Lend itself to be particularly suitable for something. This format lends itself to sleep learning. There is nothing to write, nothing to perform. Abstract vocabulary lends itself to this kind of slow, contemplative delivery. On balance, after considering all factors, the overall conclusion. On balance, the benefits of night listening outweigh the inconvenience. On balance, the approach seemed sound, not perfect, but directionally correct. The extent to which. A sophisticated way of quantifying or qualifying a claim. The extent to which grammar study accelerates fluency remains debated. I am interested in the extent to which emotional state affects language acquisition. C1 monologue. 3. The extent to which we underestimate what the sleeping mind absorbs is, I think, one of the more interesting questions in language pedagogy. As it stands, most formal approaches to language learning treat rest as a pause, a gap between sessions. But this is, insofar as the evidence suggests, precisely backwards. Sleep and the hypnagogic state that precedes it lends itself to a particular kind of absorption. Not active, not analytical, but deep. Hitherto, language education has focused almost exclusively on the waking, effortful state. What is being proposed here, albeit somewhat informally, is a complementary approach. The deliberate use of receptive, restful states to consolidate and deepen what has been formally studied. By extension, this suggests that what you listen to in the last 30 minutes before sleep matters considerably more than is commonly assumed. To that end, every lesson on this channel is designed not for performance, but for absorption. Not to be studied, but to be inhabited. On balance, I contend that the most significant advances in a learner's fluency happen not in classrooms, but in quiet rooms, late at night, in the warm territory between knowing and understanding. That is where language stops being a skill and starts being a voice. And that voice, yours in English, thinking its own thoughts, is what C1 actually is. Part 4. Advanced Patterns in Use. In this final part, we bring everything together. 5 complete C1 sentences, each using multiple structures from tonight. Listen. Shadow them quietly. Let the architecture of C1 become familiar. It is perhaps worth noting that the most significant obstacle for B2 learners is not grammatical, but conceptual. Having acquired the ability to communicate, they must now acquire the ability to think, and that transition, albeit gradual, is rarely addressed directly in formal instruction. Notice hedging, it is perhaps worth noting. Cleft sentence. The most significant obstacle is not grammatical, but conceptual, albeit. Not until one has truly absorbed a language, heard it in the dark, dreamed in it, reached for it without thinking, does one begin to understand what it means to be fluent, as opposed to merely competent. Notice, inversion. Not until, does one. Distinction between fluent and merely competent. What distinguishes C1 from B2 is, insofar as one can encapsulate it, the movement from using language to inhabiting it, from constructing sentences to generating thought, the trajectory of which is, notwithstanding its difficulty, entirely achievable. Notice wage, cleft, insofar as encapsulate, trajectory, notwithstanding. Having posited that rest is a productive state for language consolidation, it follows, by extension, that the design of what one listens to before sleep is a matter of some importance. The vocabulary should be advanced but not inaccessible. The structures complex but not labored. The tone calm enough to allow absorption rather than demand effort. Notice, participle clause. Having posited, by extension, precise qualification throughout. On balance, the path to C1 is less about accumulating knowledge than about developing a certain quality of relationship with the language, one characterized above all by the willingness to sit with complexity, to speak before one is ready, and to trust that, hitherto invisible, the progress is nonetheless real. Notice, on balance, characterized by hitherto nonetheless. The full register of C1 discourse. C1 monologue. 4. Final. I want to leave you with something that I believe to be true. Not merely as a language teacher, but as someone who has lived this trajectory. The gap between B2 and C1 can feel, from the inside, like a glass ceiling. You can see the level above you. You can touch it with your fingertips. But something prevents you from moving through. And the frustrating thing is that the harder you push, the more solid the glass seems. What I would contend, having observed this in myself and in countless learners, is this: the glass is not resistance. It is simply the surface that dissolves when you stop pushing against it. C1 arrives not through effort alone, but through accumulation. The quiet, invisible accumulation of input over time. Every lesson absorbed, every conversation followed, every night of listening that seemed in the moment to leave no trace. Not until you look back, sometimes months later, sometimes years, do you see the trajectory clearly. Do you see what those nights gave you? The structures that arrived unbidden in your speech, the vocabulary that appeared when you needed it, the ideas that found their English without being asked. Notwithstanding all the formal study, all the grammar books, all the vocabulary lists, it is, in the end, the nights that do the deepest work, the nights like this one. So rest, and trust the process, and know that hitherto every word you have heard tonight has been settling in you, not on the surface, but in the layer beneath the surface, where language actually lives. You are already further along the trajectory than you know. I'm Alina. This has been English After Midnight. C1 is not a level you reach. It is a relationship you deepen, and you are deepening it tonight. Good night.